And so no one knows how far this thing will go. But I think it's safe to say that, and one way to maybe interpret this is what I just described to you earlier, actually, about the knighthood falling in the wake of a technological change, right? A relatively simple change. We just figured out, hey, we can use this powder to create a controlled explosion and send a tiny metal ball really fast out of this pipe to kill a guy at 100 yards. I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated technology, but you wouldn't foresee all of the repercussions and second order consequences of that change that it would have on institutions and society. So another thesis of the book, which I think is very apt, is that our social institutions, our mythological realities, our artistic realities come to reflect the technologies we use day to day, right? There's a book on this that says that humans are basically natural born cyborgs. So the tools we use today, the tools of trade we use today to engage with one another and engage with the world are fundamentally different than they were 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago. And that technological change has an influence or impact on our biological Darwinian adaptive changes as well. Like we are changing too. You know, Winston Churchill has this old quote that we make our buildings and then our buildings make us. You know, there's another quote that human nature is like water. It takes the shape of its container. So we're constantly, the force of humanity is like a liquid of some kind, and whatever things we have created for ourselves, whether they are tools, whether they are institutions, whether they are cultural ways of being. I mean, these things actually shape and pattern our thoughts, how we engage with the world, et cetera, et cetera. So this particular transition has been radically accelerated by COVID-19. I mean, that's another, I think, a big obvious point. Most people won't take us too contentious. Is like, okay, we're on this pathway. We've got Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, digital, you know, the most valuable companies in the world, fastest growing companies in the world. They've eaten all the media. Digital technology is very disruptive. But then something else happened in March 2020 and I would argue that this was the first sign of the state realizing its own existential threat of this technology. It's like, oh my goodness, the nation state model is losing control because it's premised on an antiquated media technology, which is basically broadcast and paper, right? Governments are notoriously terrible at adapting digital technology. You know, we could talk about China later, but all of the sudden, and this was also in The Sovereign Individual, predicted that once nation states awakened to the existential threat that digital technology imposed, they would use something like a global pandemic to reinforce the validity of their borders, to try and flex and take back control. And I'll be damned if that's not what we just didn't see over the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. So COVID was an accelerant. Bitcoin, I think, is perhaps the single most disruptive digital technology we're ever going to see in our lifetimes. A lot of people would say the internet in general is the most disruptive technology we've ever seen. And essentially, Bitcoin is just an extension of the internet. We've had in the internet, if you define it properly, it's a stack of open source protocols for moving information around the world without asking anyone's permission. So it's the ultimate forum for free informational exchange. We can all create a website without asking any permission. I can send you encrypted messages that no one can stop. You know, we can, it's a brand new territory, if you will, that it's an ungovernable territory. Bitcoin has just added to that domain. Instead of it just being informational, we now have a place to store and transmit economic value across time and space, not just information.
Okay, so let me ask you. We're going to start to pivot here, I think. So, but I want to stay before we pivot completely to what is money. Mm-hmm. Your point that the ability to what's the term that you use in terms of violence? The person who controls violence, who is the control of violence.
Yeah, you could say, yeah, the monopolist on violence.
The monopoly on
the
violence.
State. Yeah.
The intent in a good world is that the monopoly of violence would be there to keep the bad people out and to secure the welfare and largely the asset base, the value for the citizenry or the collective for whom it's wielded, on behalf of whom it's wielded. However, there are incentives for those that are running the power and owning or managing the power to do things that are self-interested. But so let's get to the point. So if gunpowder brought down the previous system where the knight was providing certain security and welfare of some kind for the serfs, today would say that again, and I'm sticking for the time being in the realm of government states that would be considered to be good states, I guess, more free states, democratic, if democracy is a good thing. But if we say that democracy is the best form of governance we've got right now, it provides the most freedom. So let's stay in that world right now. The government has the monopoly on power, on violence, and they are the ones that have the monopoly on monetary power, on monetary policy and on taxation, right? All in theory for the good of the citizenry. How does cryptology, specifically cryptology, equate to gunpowder?
That's a great question. So let me first clarify the purpose of government or the state. I think a useful analogy would be something like a firewall, in that you want a firewall on your local area network, right? So you can make sure no outside forces or alien forces invade and steal any data or anything you have in your local area network. Well, that's effectively what a state is doing in physical reality, right? The things we call national borders are just firewalls between different communities of people, effectively. And the express and sole purpose of these firewalls in the economic sense is to preserve.
Terrific analogy, by the way. That analogy, just the more it sits, it's a great analogy. Firewall borders.
First time I've used it, actually. Yeah. The express purpose of that firewall that we call the government or the state in physical reality is to preserve private property, which I'll reiterate, to define property. It's not the thing, it's not the asset, it's the relationship between the individual and the asset, right? When you own your car, the car is not property. Your title to the car, that it's mutually acknowledged and enforceable, that's the property, right? So the express purpose of government is to preserve that relationship, which also includes, as we said earlier, your personhood, you are your own most personal property, and the rule of law, which gives us a means of non-violent dispute resolution when dispute inevitably occurs, because there are unlimited wants and limited resources, and that's the situation humanity is in. So that was just to clarify the state. Now, as we said earlier, in the economics of violence, the more profitable coercion is, the more a large central state will tend to grow. But and this is where, so we described how gunpowder changed things, but let's talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin's quite different, actually, than gunpowder, clearly. You can't shoot people with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is much more of you could classify it as a defensive technology rather than an offensive technology, in that it effectively takes the cost of defending your property, which is your relationship between you and the asset, your property and money. It takes the cost of that to near zero. So if you custody your own Bitcoin, it's just a alphanumeric string called the private key. You've basically taken physical custody of an asset that no one in the network, the miners, holders, no one in the Bitcoin network, no one in the broader global macro network can do anything about. No one's opinion can affect or change your property right in that money. Meaning that, especially if your Bitcoin, specifically if your Bitcoin is held in a multi-sig custody schema, it can't be confiscated. You can't even be coerced. You can't even be tortured to give it up, because if it's in a multi-sig, well, it takes 3 or 5. There's a certain number of days. There's all these protocols in place that prevent you from relinquishing your Bitcoin under duress. We know that Bitcoin can't be inflated, which is the most liked way of states to violate people's property rights, because no one understands it. And it has this weird illusory effect of people thinking they're getting richer while the state is stealing from them, right? We just print money and dole it out to who we want. Those are the beneficiaries of the inflation. Those that are the victims of the inflation are those living basically paycheck to paycheck, depending on the dollar to store value. And those holding assets will also benefit to some extent, in that the price of your house, the nominal price of your house is going up, the nominal price of your stock portfolio is going up, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this weird illusory or illusion effect that inflation has, that it's a systemic violation of property rights, but it has this weird psychological impact on people, that just because they have more dollars, or they have a larger number on their brokerage statement or whatever it is, they think they're richer, when in fact they're being robbed, right? The dollar itself is being diluted, not the value of their assets being increased. So Bitcoin is something that takes that cost of defense in the property we call money to near zero. And again, if the express and sole purpose of government is to preserve property rights, money being the most important property of all, right? It's 1/2 of every transaction. All of a sudden, we've taken away half of the relevance of government. We no longer need government to preserve the relationship between an individual and their money. You now have the Bitcoin mining network. And if you tie into that as well, that since March 2020, I think governments worldwide are generating about 1/2 of their revenue via inflation. So governments can send you a direct tax bill, or they can print money. These are the two ways governments generate revenue. Well, Bitcoin has kind of closed that second window in a way. I mean, clearly governments can still print money. It's still going to work for 10 years, decades, however long it's going to take. But in the long run, there is no rational economic actor given a choice that will voluntarily hold a currency that can be arbitrarily debased or depreciated, when they have an option to hold one that cannot be. One that cannot be confiscated, cannot be inflated, cannot be stopped, cannot be reversed. It's just immune to all opinion. And ultimately, that's the point of money. If I'm an entrepreneur and I go into the marketplace and I want to take risk with my capital in pursuit of a return, I'm taking real risk, right? I might lose money. But if I make money, if I'm profitable, if I render a good and service that people deem satisfactory, and I do it in a profitable way, well, then I want to secure my wealth and my net worth in the counterparty risk minimized, or said differently, trust minimized asset. And that is a definition of money, like the place you can put your economic energy that is maximally insulated from all the actions and opinions of others. That's what money is intended to be, and that's what Bitcoin is effectively perfected.